Afternoon all. I'm very keen to go over the last round win that Magnus Carlsen had over Nigel Short. I know Nigel was having a not very good tournament at all. I mean, he lost quite a few games. Maybe he was always trying to play surprise moves, it seems, in the openings. And against Vishy Anand, he had a magnificent tactic which didn't quite work out. Which maybe I'll video annotate that game soon as well. But this last round game secured Magnus victory at the London Classic. And let's have a look at it. So E4 was played by Magnus, and Nigel Short responded with the French defence, which he's played for many years. After D4, D5, we have Knight D2, which is the Tarrasch variation. So often you'll see me in blitz games playing Knight F6 to try and close up the position. So like a move like Knight F6 is like classical sort of Tarrasch, and there's tons and tons of opening theory in that. And there's also some quiet waiting moves as well in certain lines, or there's unusual lines with Knight C6. It's vast territory, the Tarrasch variation anyway. But this next move, D takes E4, is not a move that, as black, when I played French, I particularly would consider that much playing. Except recently I've been using a kind of Fort Knox system where bishop D7 to C6, get rid of the bishop, and then C6 later. You get a kind of favourable kind of Caro-Kann rock solid structure. It's like a useful Caro-Kann transposition in a way. Anyway, so D takes E4. Okay, so Knight takes E4, and okay, let's look at the structure. Structurally, White could end up with problems like an isolated queen's pawn because Black's got that D file pressure. In return, White's got maybe a potentially useful outpost square on E5 using this semi-open E file when he castles, sticks a rook maybe on E1. So the structure's sort of interesting. Not amazingly interesting, but okay. So Knight D7, as if Nigel was keen to just trade knights with a later Knight F6, but actually after Knight F3, the move Bishop E7 is played. Okay, so Knight F6 has been delayed, and now Magnus plays Bishop C4. Okay, the bishop, sometimes. I'll be tempted to put it on D3, but maybe C4 is very interesting as well. Maybe on C4, White has got more control over the D4 square with his queen. Maybe the bishop can retreat back on this diagonal later if needed. It's got some useful points. I can't see too many downsides in this position. Knight G6, and now okay, so does Magnus want to take the knight, or maybe Knight G3? Knight G3 puts the knight in a bit of a passive square actually, and maybe Black would just continue with castles and later C5. What would the knight be doing? It really wouldn't be threatening that sort of much menace on the king side. It's difficult to say, and Black could maybe play B6, Bishop B7 and C5 and equalise quite comfortably later. So this key decision here is kind of interesting. Knight takes F6 check. Okay, so Nigel takes with the knight, and now both sides castle. And now we see. I think this is an interesting move of the game because it combines several decisions with one move. And I think it's all based on this sort of lagging bishop on the queen side, which is a strategic issue, quite common strategic issue for Black. But with this next move, Magnus is positively inviting a thematic kind of pawn break from Black, C5, and is he gonna passively defend that pawn, which would lead to a nice queen's pawn, which I think would give Black a nice blockading square on D5, or does he use this other option, which is actually to positively invite the exchange of queens? And you might think, well, with the exchange of queens, where is White's advantage going? Is it going to disappear totally? The big advantage of this continuation, though, that Magnus plays, so he plays D takes C5, he's got no structural issue here. There's a bit of a dynamic issue with f2 though, if this bishop is energetically, you know, going on this diagonal for the moment, because then maybe even knight e4 and g4 is going to be, you know, not knight g4, but knight e4 is going to be potentially dangerous. But Nigel takes the opportunity to exchange off queens, but look at that bishop, it's not looking particularly healthy for being developed here. So bishop takes c5, and as though, you know, black has got a bit of a dynamic pressure, but these pieces are still, you know, they're waiting to get outside of the box at the moment. And it's with this queen side that maybe, you know, Magnus's next move is designed against, bishop e2. So the bishop, you know, it did its job on c4, just developed, but now, you know, it's going to pounce with bishop f3 now on that lovely diagonal if b6 is played to try and routinely develop the bishop. So here now, Nigel's faced with a kind of uncomfortable position. I don't know if you were playing black here, how you would like this position. It doesn't look as though too much is going on tactically for either side, but white has a lot of the trump cards. You know, that possession of the d file, you know, the potential for bishop f3, you know, everything's kind of nice. If you look at all the pieces, they're kind of nice. This is kind of a nice position to have with white, a kind of riskless small pull on the position. Okay, so Nigel plays knight e4. So how to defend this f2 pawn? Well, bishop e3 might, you know, it might be an uncomfortable pawn fracture. If you play bishop e3, okay, you're still targeting that bishop, but takes doesn't, you know, look great for the structure, but it looks actually still kind of pleasant, to be honest, for white. But actually, there's a more elegant looking move which doesn't need a structural issue. Knight d3. So just attacking and defending actually the bishop on c5 and defending f2. Elegant retreat. Bishop e7 now was chosen. Okay, let's see. I mean, why not bishop b6? Bishop b6. Does that have any major downsides? I'm not totally sure. Maybe bishop f4 would be uncomfortable, and then trying to get the bishop on this diagonal, you know, to d6, so the bishop's on b6. Also, it's hemming in the b pawn as well, so it's got some downsides to go to b6. So Nigel chose bishop e7. Okay, and that also sort of helps, you know, these entry points. They're all guarded against the rook. You know, that bishop's defensive, and more, maybe it can come to this diagonal as well. Okay, so bishop e7's got some merits to it. Bishop e3 though. So seizing that diagonal and targeting that a7 pawn. So you'll notice that the rook's not able to go to b8 now, and black really doesn't want to, you know, create dark square weaknesses with a move like a6, if he can help it, or, you know, move these pawns. They're a bit vulnerable. There's a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side potentially, but and these bishops are potentially raking down these diagonals on the black queen side. Okay, so in this position, Nigel elected for the move h6. Alright, okay, that provides a pigeonhole for the king, for back row issues maybe. What else does it do? Maybe there's a potential for bishop g5s even, it's supported by that. It's a bit of a waiting move as well. Ideally, you know, black does want to solve the development issues, I guess, and maybe, you know, b6 is not particularly on the cards at the moment. A move like bishop f3 or knight e5 looks a bit nasty. If bishop b7, there'll be rook d7. So this d-file pressure actually, although white's, you know, as well as solving the structural issue, the d-file pressure is really targeting this poor bishop, struggling to develop in this game. In the variations here, it seems very tricky. Just to implement, you know, simple basic completing the development task. Okay, so a4, and now there's a major concession in a way from Nigel. This a5 move, he's weakened b5. Okay, a knight can't pounce there at the moment. It doesn't seem that exploitable, but it is a target also on a5. b6 is also weakened for any, you know, potential, you know, bishop b6. But in this game, actually, the knight actually rerouted to b6, as we're about to see. So there are some severe issues weakening these two squares. g3, okay, g3 provides a pigeonhole for white, another quiet waiting move from white, seeing what black's doing. Bit of cat and mouse from both sides, but black's in the more uncomfortable position to play this cat and mouse game. And finally, there's a committal move from black with regard to the d file, rook d8. And now Magnus doesn't mind trading rooks even, so knight e5, he wants to get rid of black's active pieces. Getting rid of that rook would be an interesting thing, but he wants to do that, you know, as nicely as possible with greatest advantage to him. So after knight f6, he's not keen to snap off the rook himself with rook d8. Instead, he tortures Nigel with this next move, pouncing on that sensitive b6 square now, with this lovely positional move. I wonder if you can guess it, actually. I should have given enough clues. Simple positional move, 5 seconds. Okay, knight c4, yeah, just get a knight there to restrain, you know, the black queen side, target these guys. Okay, so Nigel takes a couple of rooks off. Okay, but it still leaves white with this nagging advantage here in this position. But knight d5 shielding that d file, protecting b6. And also, if knight b6, it seems as though black, you know, has knight takes e3 attacking the rook, which would wreck white's structure a little bit, white's pawn structure. But Magnus decides here it doesn't matter. He plays knight b6 anyway, and we see this knight takes e3 move. So f takes e3. But is the e3 pawn really a meaningful target for this, say, dark square bishop? At the moment, black has to solve the immediate problem of not losing material. And after rook b8, okay, e3, how is the problem solved? Well, Magnus chooses actually king f2. So the king's coming into the game via that f2 square, protecting e3. If say, bishop c5, it'll be disastrous rook d8 check anyway. The rook is always threatening stuff on the d file, and that entry point d8 has to be guarded by that bishop on e7. So Nigel's in a desperate position, because what is he doing here? He can't move his bishop, he can't move his rook, and he can't move this bishop either because of d8. Can he try moving his king? Maybe king h7? I don't know, it all looks a bit dire, in fact, here. The move he chose actually just loses a pawn, but you know, maybe that's intended to try and generate some counterplay. So e5, so rook d5, just forking these two pawns. So what is he going to get for his pawn? Well, bishop e6, he's at least getting his pieces off that first rank. The bishop's got a more useful diagonal, it seems, you know, in both directions. Okay, but he's losing his a pawn, which could spell sort of the end of the game eventually. Okay, so rook d8. And now bishop d3, so safeguarding that d file from rook d2 checks. So we see a little bit of black counterplay, but is it enough? The bishop actually decides it doesn't want to be on this diagonal where it could have, you know, struck on these two squares. Instead, bishop f6, as though maybe e4 and bishop takes b2 as friend. So against that, Magnus decides to seal black from stopping playing e4. But now we see rook d4, so a little bit of pressure from the rook. So contrast this to the other position where Nigel hadn't lost his a pawn. Okay, he's generated something. I'm not quite sure it's enough though. Rook b5, the knight's neatly protecting the a pawn here, so white can start ganging up on b7. g6 and now a5. Now the knight's free to move. Maybe to d5 to attack b7. King g7. Now, curious move, king e2, as though maybe c3 at some point is going to be dangerous because the king's like protecting the bishop. But Nigel threw in a check and the king just retreated back to f2. So was it a time waste? Bit of cat and mouse maybe. Bishop e6. Now king f3. So protecting e4, which means the bishop might be free to move if needed. So white's maybe trying to increase slightly, gradually, a little bit of flexibility in his position. But it also encourages Nigel a committal pawn move to be played with h5. But now finally white uses the knight to go to d5, using that pawn on e4. So we see now also with this move that the rook is unveiled a threat to just snap up that pawn. So bishop d8 indirectly defends that pawn because the bishop takes a5 with rook b7. So the pawn is now protected, renewing the threat. Rook takes b7 sympathy. Now bishop c8. Now in this position there's a remarkable tactic which I checked with an engine actually, which doesn't quite work here. which would have been the move a6, because if takes rook b8, if black doesn't have bishop g4 check, he'll be losing his bishop, one of his bishops. So just bear that in mind, that if the king's kept on this diagonal, there's bishop g4 check. So this next move is kind of interesting, toying with Nigel, king e2. As though, you know, why keep the king on this diagonal? Why not threaten, like, get the king off to play a6? Well, I don't know, maybe Magnus had spotted this, and he's just saying, you know, maybe I can just play with you with king d2 and threaten even c3 to trap the rook. Okay, so bishop g4 check was played here. Now finally the king comes off, okay, this checking diagonal, which means if any bishop c8 now is a6 really does just win on the spot. So Nigel's in actually a terrible position here. With no bishop c8 available, he's going to lose his b7 pawn as well, which means the a pawn spells doom for black, unfortunately. Nigel tries to, I don't know, generate some counterplay with f5, but these three pieces are not enough to gang up on the white king here. Especially with Magnus's very elegant play now. He takes the b7 pawn, unfortunately with check as well, because the f pawn left the king more exposed. And now Magnus speeds up his whole a pawn queening plan, just with an idea just to sack his e pawn for speed. He doesn't really want to give the rook and bishop coordination, and this bishop potentially, you know, coming into the game as well. Instead, he just doesn't mind sacking the e pawn. He plays knight e3, also immediately threatening just to snap off that bishop anyway, which would take away all the threats from the black position. For example, takes on e4. You can imagine, you know, maybe just take and then just bishop e2. Lovely position. Even though it's opposite colour bishops, this a6 would seem, I think, completely decisive here. So Nigel, he doesn't want to lose his bishop. He plays bishop f3, but it's a disaster because the a pawn now just a6. Doesn't matter about losing the e pawn. Bishop e2. The last threat made by Nigel, bishop g5, is fairly harmless actually. There's no mating net here, so just a7, and Nigel has to resign. And with this, Magnus he takes first place at the Classic, despite his first round loss. His last round win here secured him first place. Let's have a look in overview and summary. Here, by the way, let's just make sure this is harmless. We take queen. You know, there's only a spite check. King f2. There's nothing here going on now. e3. The king takes, you know, f3. So yeah, let's go and have a quick summary overview of this game. So French defense with d takes e4. So the usual plan for black in this structure would be to lash out later with c5, but it seems to be a move welcomed by Magnus, just playing on a somewhat subtle strategic trump card, this bishop on c8 it seems. So he doesn't mind even, you know, the queen's coming off, because he doesn't want to be saddled with an isolated queen's pawn. So this knight e5 is a very clever move, I think. Okay, so c5 is played, and Magnus welcomes the exchange of queens. This nagging, annoying pressure and this poor bishop on c8, it spells major issues really at this level. So bishop takes c5, bishop e2, just targeting that diagonal if b6 is going to be played to try and, you know, develop that bishop. So knight e4, whoops, knight e4, knight d3, just defending and attacking f2 and attacking the bishop. Bishop decides to go to e7, but now with that retreat, there's bishop e3, just seizing that important diagonal, provoking further weaknesses soon from black in the form of a5. Now immediately here, a5. If black hadn't done that, then I don't know, a5 and bishop f3 and a6 looks pretty menacing, with both these bishops raking down these diagonals. Would be fairly nasty for black. Okay, sorry, this diagonal and that diagonal as an option. So a5, so b6 is now sensitive, which is used as a sort of knight maneuver. But first, this g3 gives the king an entry potentially into the game, cuts out some black possibilities as well. Okay, so rook d8 and now knight e5. Not minding an exchange of rooks, but encouraging Nigel to do the exchange, because because he wants to gain a bit more time with his b6 exploitation. So Nigel takes a couple of rooks off, but he's left with this seemingly dry position with not much counterplay. The counterplay does have now knight d5. Okay, causes a bit of a fracture in white's pawn structure. We can see 3 pawn islands here, but are they significant? Are they exploitable? No, because the move king f2 is going to be a real safeguard for white's e3 pawn, and leaving black anyway with this terrible position. He can't move the bishop anyway because of rook d8. So e5, Nigel starts to go completely downhill, but doesn't seem to be anything he can do anyway here. His counterplay is really at minimal level. Now, if white has a free hand to do anything he wants, you know, maybe bishop f3, c3, knight takes c8, and then bishop takes b7, for example. That's just one example. Or there's other examples here as well. I mean, if white's given a free hand, you know, bishop b5 to d7 as well. Just coming in with a rook to the 7th rank forcibly. Just exchange this off, or even just knight takes c8 and rook d7. There's all these like possibilities to win potentially material. I think move c3 comes in handy in some of those ideas. So e5, Nigel's not content to just still sit and watch white further improve the position effortlessly. So he gets a bit of piece activity, but loses his a pawn. And now the counterplay really is controlled. So e4 stamping out e4 from black, and now the b7 pawn gets targeted. And now this curious episode where if the king's not on this light square diagonal, then in order to defend the b7 pawn soon, the bishops cannot be lined up like this on c8 and d8, because a6 will be really destructive because of the takes and rook b8 idea. So this situation is starting to be arranged now. b4 putting more pressure on c8. So we see here a glimmer that a6 is on the cards if the king's not on this light square diagonal, for bishop g4 to save black. So there's a bit of toying now with this king e2. So now finally there's a big problem with b7, and that's why it has to be lost. Bishop c8, there'll be a6. Okay, so Nigel's losing his b7 pawn now, and the a pawn is just simply quite easy for a player of Magnus's standard just to convert. He just doesn't mind sacking the e pawn for a bit of speed for this plan, and that's it. a7, I think that's it. Nigel resigns. Comments or questions on YouTube, and hope you have a great new year when it comes for you, if it hasn't already, if you're in Australia or whatever. So happy new year 2011 when it comes. Whoa, time does fly when you're having fun. Thanks very much.